May thy servant Camilla, who wears this crown, be filled by thine abundant grace, and with all...
Okay, stay with me for a moment, because this title means something far more serious than a disagreement between a husband and wife. King Charles has reportedly made a decision that sharply reduces Camilla's influence over sensitive royal family matters, and the reason behind it reaches directly into the future of the monarchy. What makes this different is that William and Catherine are tied to the shift, turning a private disagreement into a much larger question about who will shape the royal family next. The tension reportedly came to a head during a private meeting at Clarence House, where Charles refused to reverse the course he had chosen. Camilla strongly opposed the move, but the king stood firm, and according to the scenario surrounding these reports, the most painful part was not simply losing influence. It was discovering that Charles had already approved a longer-term restructuring that would move important responsibilities toward William and Catherine. That is why the reaction surrounding Camilla has been so intense. For years, she has stood beside Charles through some of the most demanding periods of his public life. She has built a role within the institution and become a familiar presence at his side. So when a decision comes from Charles himself that limits her influence, the question is not merely what he took away. The real question is why he decided that the old arrangement could no longer continue. Hi viewers, if you were in Camilla's position and the person you trusted most suddenly reduced your influence, would you feel betrayed? Tell us honestly in the comments, then stay with this story, because the reason behind Charles's decision is where this becomes much more uncomfortable. The private meeting did not reportedly begin with shouting or some spectacular public confrontation. That is precisely what makes the situation so compelling. The important decisions inside a royal household rarely need an audience. A document placed on a desk can carry more weight than a speech. A sentence spoken quietly can alter the balance of an entire institution, and that was the atmosphere surrounding Charles's decision. Camilla reportedly entered the discussion believing the issue could still be challenged. There were arrangements she did not agree with. There were concerns about the direction being taken, and there was an expectation that Charles, after hearing her objections, might reconsider. Instead, the king refused. That single refusal changed the temperature of the meeting, because if Charles had simply asked for a temporary adjustment, the damage could have been contained. If he had suggested that certain responsibilities needed to be reviewed, there would have been room for negotiation. But the reports surrounding this story point towards something more permanent. Charles was not merely asking Camilla to step back for a moment. He was reconsidering where influence should sit when sensitive matters involving the royal family were being handled. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Why now?
I remember coming to see our Maggie's just after the king being diagnosed. Nobody could say anything at the time. That was quite difficult. I almost said something, but I felt that it...
The answer, according to the narrative surrounding the dispute, begins with William. Prince William's concerns reportedly brought greater attention to arrangements involving Catherine and the monarchy's future direction. His position carried particular weight because he is not simply another member of the family. He represents the next stage of the institution. That distinction matters. A disagreement between Camilla and William could have been treated as another family disagreement. But once William's concerns became connected to questions about succession, responsibility, and the long-term structure of the monarchy, Charles faced a different kind of decision. He was no longer simply deciding who was right in a family argument. He was deciding what kind of institution he wanted to leave behind. And this is where the story begins to turn. Charles had spent years building his public role around continuity. The monarchy survives by moving carefully, preserving tradition while preparing for change. Every generation inherits responsibilities from the one before it. But those responsibilities do not remain frozen forever. William's growing importance made that impossible. The future had already entered the room. Catherine's position also became part of the conversation, because the future monarchy would not be shaped by William alone. Together, William and Catherine represent a different phase of royal life, one that Charles cannot ignore if he is thinking beyond his own reign. For Camilla, however, that shift could feel very different. From her perspective, the issue was not simply about the future. She had responsibilities in the present. She had spent years supporting Charles and carrying the weight that came with being beside him. Any reduction in her influence could therefore feel less like ordinary administrative change and more like a judgment on the role she had built. That is where the emotional pressure began to rise. There was also another complication. The decision reportedly followed a review of confidential correspondence and earlier arrangements that had quietly created friction within the family. These details remain matters of royal speculation rather than something publicly established in full, but within the story they provide the missing link between the private disagreement and Charles's eventual decision.
I mean, my daughter has been absolutely wonderful with all these charities. It takes a huge interest. So they were all telling me anyway about what a difference she makes.
The correspondence mattered because it suggested the conflict had not appeared overnight. There had been concerns. There had been competing expectations. There had been different ideas about how certain responsibilities should be handled. And eventually, those disagreements became impossible for Charles to ignore. This is what makes the situation more significant than a simple disagreement between Camilla and William. The real pressure came from several directions at once. Charles had to balance his relationship with Camilla against his responsibility to the crown. William was looking toward the future. Catherine's position was tied to that future, and the king was being forced to decide whether maintaining the existing balance was actually serving the institution he was supposed to protect. That decision came with a price. Whatever Charles chose, someone would be hurt. If he sided completely with Camilla, William could view the arrangement as a barrier to the future direction of the monarchy. If he sided with William and moved responsibilities away from Camilla, he risked creating resentment inside his own household. There was no painless option, yet Charles made one, and the significance of that choice becomes clearer when considering what happened next. Camilla's opposition did not persuade him to reverse course. That was the moment the story moved beyond disagreement. The reports surrounding the decision suggest Charles had already begun thinking in terms of structural change. He was not merely reacting to one conversation. He was looking at the larger question of how responsibilities should be distributed and which members of the family should have greater influence over matters connected to the monarchy's future. That means the private meeting at Clarence House was not necessarily where the decision was born. It may have been where Camilla finally discovered how far the decision had already gone. And that distinction is crucial, because there is a world of difference between hearing that a king is considering a change and realizing that the king has already made it. For Camilla, that realization would have carried a particular sting. The person sitting across from her was not a distant official. It was Charles, the same man whose public journey she had shared for years, the same king whose side she had occupied through enormous scrutiny. And now, according to the reports and speculation surrounding this story, he was telling her that some of the influence she believed she still possessed would no longer be hers to exercise. The silence after such a decision can sometimes say more than the argument itself, because once the decision is made, the question changes. It is no longer, can Camilla stop this? It becomes, what else has Charles already decided? That is the question the next part exposes. And if viewers simply watch this decision unfold without asking whether they would tolerate the same treatment themselves, they may miss the moment when this family disagreement turns into something much bigger. Stay with the story, because what Charles had quietly set in motion was about to make Camilla's position even more difficult. The decision had been made, but William's challenge was the pressure point that made Charles look at the entire arrangement differently. That matters because William was not simply objecting to one responsibility or one conversation. The issue, according to the reports and speculation surrounding this story, touched the direction of the monarchy itself. Catherine's role was part of that discussion, and once the future king became directly involved, Charles had to consider more than the feelings of the people closest to him. William's position carried a weight that could not easily be dismissed. Every major choice made during Charles's reign exists within a larger timeline. The king governs the present, but the institution must also prepare for the future. William will eventually inherit the crown, and Catherine will stand beside him. That reality changes how Charles must evaluate decisions involving influence access, and responsibility. The concern reportedly presented to Charles was not framed simply as a personal complaint against Camilla. It was connected to how sensitive matters should be handled and who should have a meaningful voice when decisions could affect the monarchy beyond the current reign. That distinction created the first real fracture in the situation. If William had been asking only for himself, Charles could have treated the disagreement as family tension. But if the issue involved the future structure of the institution, refusing to examine it could create a larger problem later. Charles therefore had a difficult choice. He could protect the existing balance and risk allowing resentment to deepen around William and Catherine. Or he could adjust the balance and risk making Camilla feel that the position she had built beside him was being quietly weakened. Neither option was comfortable. But the king began looking at the evidence surrounding the dispute. The confidential correspondence reportedly under review became important because it offered a record of decisions, expectations, and disagreements that had developed away from public cameras. The public could see smiles at ceremonies and carefully managed appearances. What they could not see was the private negotiation behind them. That private layer is where the story becomes more complicated. According to the narrative surrounding the case, some arrangements had created friction because different members of the family did not see responsibility in the same way. Camilla's supporters could view her involvement as practical and justified. Those concerned about the future could see the same influence as something that needed clearer boundaries. Charles was caught between those interpretations. The king also had to consider precedent. Once one person gains influence over sensitive matters, removing that influence can be difficult without creating questions about why the change happened. Keeping it can be equally difficult if other senior royals believe the arrangement no longer fits the direction of the institution. This was no longer a question of personal preference. It was becoming a question of authority, and William's involvement made the stakes higher. The future king could not simply be treated as another relative expressing an opinion. His concerns had to be weighed against the responsibilities Charles had inherited and the responsibilities William would eventually inherit himself. That is why the king's review became so important. He was not merely deciding whether Camilla had crossed a line. He was deciding whether the existing distribution of influence still made sense. That review also changed the way earlier disagreements could be interpreted. A decision that once looked isolated could suddenly appear connected to a larger pattern. A disagreement that seemed manageable could become evidence of a deeper structural problem. And once Charles began looking at the issue through that lens, the possibility of changing Camilla's role became much more realistic. This is where the title begins to reveal its real meaning. Camilla's devastation was not simply about losing a privilege. It was about losing certainty. For years, she could reasonably believe that her position beside Charles gave her a stable place within the machinery of the monarchy. Now that certainty was being challenged from inside the institution itself, and the person forcing Charles to examine that balance was William. That did not necessarily mean William wanted Camilla pushed aside. The available claims do not establish that as a fact. But the effect of his challenge, according to the story, was to make Charles confront a question he might otherwise have postponed. How much influence should belong to the present, and how much should already be moving toward the future? The answer would affect more than Camilla. It would affect William. It would affect Catherine, and it could influence how the monarchy prepares for the next transition of power. That is why Charles could not simply end the disagreement by asking everyone to move on. The pressure had changed. William's challenge had placed the king in a position where silence itself could become a decision. If he ignored the concerns, the existing tension could continue. If he acted, someone close to him would feel the consequences. Charles chose to act. But there was still something Camilla did not know. The king was not approaching the issue as though he were making a single adjustment. He was considering a broader redistribution of responsibility. That possibility explains why the Clarence House meeting carried such weight. Camilla was confronting the visible part of the decision. Charles was dealing with the larger structure behind it, and that larger structure involved William and Catherine. For the first time, the dispute was no longer only about who had influence today. It was about who would have influence tomorrow. That shift also explains why the situation could not be settled through a simple apology or compromise. A personal disagreement can be repaired. A structural decision is much harder to undo once it has been approved. The tension inside the family therefore moved into a new phase. William had raised the issue. Charles had reviewed it. Camilla had resisted the consequences. Now the king had to determine exactly what would change. And the answer was more serious than Camilla had expected. Before that answer became known, however, another question was beginning to dominate the situation. If Charles was truly preparing the monarchy for the next generation, why had he chosen this moment to reduce Camilla's influence? That question matters because timing can reveal intention. A temporary dispute would have required temporary measures. A permanent transition required something much more deliberate. The reports surrounding the story suggest Charles was moving toward the second option. That is where the pressure on Camilla became impossible to ignore. She was no longer defending an arrangement against criticism. She was facing the possibility that the king had decided the arrangement itself had reached its limit. And if that was true, then the meeting at Clarence House had never been about persuading Charles. It had been about informing Camilla of a decision already moving forward. That realization would make the next confrontation far more serious. The audience should also understand why this mattered beyond royal personalities. The monarchy depends heavily on controlled roles. Public duties can be redistributed. Private influence is harder to measure, but it can shape how decisions are discussed before they ever become public. Reducing that influence can therefore change the internal balance without announcing a dramatic removal. That subtlety makes this story significant. There was no need for a public dismissal, no need for a dramatic announcement. A change in responsibility could accomplish the same thing quietly. And that is exactly why Camilla's reaction becomes so important. If she believed her role remained secure, Charles's decision would feel like an isolated disagreement. If she understood that the structure itself was changing, the emotional impact would be completely different. The king had not simply rejected her argument. He had begun redefining the boundaries around her influence. William's challenge had opened that door. Catherine's future role strengthened the argument for change. And Charles's review gave the decision institutional weight. The question now was whether Camilla could accept that new reality, or whether the disagreement would become an even deeper confrontation between the king and his queen. The answer was waiting inside the next exchange. And if this decision makes you believe Camilla should not be quietly pushed aside after everything she has endured, do not just watch in silence. Like this story, share it, subscribe, and stay with what comes next. Because the next part reveals why Charles's refusal hurt far more than anyone expected. The room had gone quiet by the time Camilla understood that Charles was not asking for permission. He had already decided. That was the point at which the disagreement stopped being a disagreement and became a confrontation. The reports surrounding the private meeting describe a king who had listened to the objections, considered the competing positions, and then refused to retreat. For Camilla, the shock came from the finality of that response. She had expected resistance. She had expected an argument. What she had not expected was Charles making it clear that the decision would stand. The significance of that moment was not simply that Camilla had lost an argument with her husband. It was that the boundaries of her influence were being redrawn by the very person whose reign had given her the position she held. And there was no audience in the room to soften the moment. No cameras, no prepared statement, no carefully chosen words for the public. Only the king, his queen, and a decision that neither could pretend had not happened. The claims surrounding the meeting suggest that Camilla strongly opposed the changes. That reaction is understandable within the story, because the decision affected areas where she believed her experience and judgment still carried weight. But Charles did not reverse course. That refusal would have been painful enough. Then came the explanation. The king was not presenting the move as a punishment. He was treating it as part of a wider adjustment in how sensitive royal matters would be handled. That distinction mattered because it removed the easiest path to reconciliation. If Camilla had simply been reprimanded, there could have been an apology. If she had misunderstood an instruction, there could have been clarification. If Charles had wanted only to settle one dispute, there could have been a compromise. Instead, the decision was being framed as a change in structure. That meant Camilla could not solve it by winning the argument in front of her. The rules around her influence were changing, and once she understood that, the emotional weight of the meeting became much heavier. For someone who had spent years building a place beside Charles, the message was difficult to hear. Her public role could remain visible while her private influence became narrower. The distinction is important because power inside an institution does not always disappear with a title. Sometimes it disappears through access, responsibility, and the ability to shape decisions before they reach the public. That was the territory Charles was entering. The reports suggest he wanted sensitive matters handled with clearer lines of responsibility. William and Catherine were central to that future-facing approach. Camilla, meanwhile, was being asked to accept limits that she had not chosen. This created a painful contradiction. Camilla could remain queen consort and still find that some of the influence attached to her position had been reduced. Publicly, the change might appear subtle. Privately, it could feel enormous. That is why the meeting mattered. The issue was not whether Camilla would continue attending engagements or standing beside Charles at official events. Nothing in the premise required such a dramatic removal. The issue was what happened behind those appearances. Who would be consulted? Who would have the final say? Who would be trusted with sensitive matters? And who would be expected to step back? Those questions were suddenly much harder to answer. The king's position also carried an emotional cost for him. Charles was not dealing with a distant official. He was making a decision involving his wife and closest companion. Whatever the institutional argument, there was a personal relationship underneath it. That made the refusal more revealing. He was willing to absorb the private discomfort because he believed the wider issue required action. The exact private words exchanged remain unknown, and claims about the conversation should therefore be treated carefully. But the central conflict is clear within the story. Camilla opposed the move while Charles refused to reverse it. That alone would have created a serious fracture. Then the conversation moved toward the future. William and Catherine were no longer simply names connected to an earlier concern. Their position represented the direction Charles believed the monarchy had to prepare for. The king was looking beyond the immediate dispute and toward the institution that would eventually pass into William's hands. That changed the meaning of every decision. A responsibility given to Camilla today could shape expectations tomorrow. A responsibility transferred to William and Catherine could become part of the framework they inherited later. Charles therefore had to think beyond the emotional impact of the moment. But Camilla was living inside that moment. For her, the future was being used to justify a present loss. That is where resentment could begin. It is one thing to be told that change is inevitable. It is another to discover that change has already been approved without your agreement. And there was another detail that made the situation more difficult. The decision reportedly followed Charles's review of confidential correspondence connected to the disagreements. Those documents, according to the story, helped convince him that the problem was not limited to one isolated dispute. That meant the king was looking backward while also planning forward. He was examining how certain arrangements had developed, how they had created friction, and what needed to change before those tensions became harder to control. For Camilla, this could only make the situation feel more personal. If Charles had reviewed the history of the disagreements and still reached the same conclusion, then persuasion would become much harder. The door was closing. The question was whether Camilla realized how far it had already closed. The answer came when Charles made clear that he would not simply restore the old arrangement. That was the point where the meeting acquired its deepest emotional force. Camilla was not being told to wait. She was not being told that the matter would be reconsidered next month. She was being told that the king had chosen a different direction. And once that happened, the balance between them could never feel quite the same. This is also why the story cannot be reduced to a simple rivalry between Camilla and William. William's challenge may have triggered the review, but Charles made the final choice. The responsibility belonged to the king. That distinction matters because it places the real conflict where it belongs. Camilla was not merely fighting William. She was confronting Charles's judgment, and Charles was not merely defending William, he was defending the direction he believed the monarchy needed to take. Those two positions could exist in the same family, but they could not remain unchanged forever. The silence after the disagreement would therefore have carried its own message. Camilla now knew that Charles was prepared to place institutional considerations ahead of her objections. She also knew that William and Catherine stood to gain greater responsibility from the restructuring. What she did not yet know was how permanent that shift would be. That information was still ahead. And it was the detail that could transform disappointment into devastation. Because if Charles had merely limited her influence for a short period, the damage could eventually be repaired. If he had already approved a permanent redistribution, then Camilla was facing something far more difficult. She was facing a new reality. The public would see ceremonies, appearances, and familiar royal photographs. Behind them, however, the balance of influence could be changing. That contrast is what makes the story so compelling. A royal family can look united while its internal responsibilities are being rearranged. The public does not always see the moment when power moves. Sometimes the most consequential shift happens quietly, in a private room, through a decision that does not require an announcement. That is what made Charles's refusal so important. He had drawn a line. Camilla had challenged it. He had kept it in place. And now the consequences were moving beyond the original disagreement. And that possibility raised one final concern inside the meeting. Once responsibility begins moving from one generation to another, restoring the old balance becomes increasingly difficult. Every transfer creates a precedent. Every new assignment creates an expectation. Every person moved closer to the center gains a stronger claim on the future. That meant Charles was not simply changing today's arrangement. He could be establishing the pattern that others would inherit. For Camilla, that was the part she had not understood when she entered the room. The next stage would determine whether this was simply a difficult moment between Charles and Camilla, or the beginning of a permanent change in the family's internal balance. If viewers believe Camilla deserved to know exactly how far this decision would go before it was made, then staying silent only lets the story disappear beneath the polished royal image. Like, share, and subscribe if they believe these decisions deserve scrutiny, because the next revelation is where Camilla learns just how permanent Charles's choice really was. The part Camilla feared most was no longer hidden behind the closed doors of Clarence House. The decision had moved beyond the argument. It had become a plan. What emerged from the reports surrounding the dispute was a far more consequential picture. Charles was not simply taking away a few responsibilities and waiting to see what happened next. The story points to a permanent restructuring in which important areas of royal responsibility would increasingly move toward William and Catherine. That changed everything. Camilla could accept a disagreement. She could even accept Charles telling her that certain matters needed to be handled differently. But a permanent redistribution carried a different message. It suggested that the king had begun preparing the monarchy for a future in which her influence would be smaller than she had expected. That was the hidden bombshell. The title says Camilla was devastated, but the deeper reason was not simply that Charles had rejected her position. It was that she was discovering the decision had consequences far beyond the meeting itself. The change was about direction. William and Catherine represented the next stage of the institution. Their responsibilities could grow without requiring a dramatic public announcement. A duty could be reassigned. A sensitive matter could be routed through a different office. A decision could be discussed with different people before reaching the king. None of those changes would necessarily make headlines on their own. Together, however, they could transform the internal balance. That is why this moment mattered. Camilla's public position could remain intact while her private influence became narrower. She could still stand beside Charles at major events, continue royal engagements, and appear fully established within the monarchy. Yet behind those appearances, the channels through which influence moved could be changing. The public might see continuity, but inside the institution, that continuity could already be giving way to careful succession planning. And once that process begins, reversing it becomes difficult. The reports and speculation around this story suggest Charles had approved the restructuring with the future in mind. The exact private arrangements have not been publicly established in full, so the details remain part of the wider royal speculation. But within the narrative, one point drives the entire conflict. Charles was no longer treating the existing balance as permanent. He was preparing for what comes after him. That is where William's challenge takes on greater significance. William did not need to demand Camilla's removal for the situation to change. His concerns had already forced Charles to examine how responsibilities were distributed. Once the king began considering the monarchy beyond his own reign, William's eventual position became impossible to ignore. Catherine's involvement added another layer. The future institution would not rest on William alone. Catherine would also occupy a central position beside him. Moving certain responsibilities toward them, therefore, represented more than a transfer between family members. It represented a gradual shift from one generation to another. For Camilla, that could feel like being moved away from the center without being publicly removed. That distinction explains the emotional force of the decision. She was not being told that she no longer mattered. She was being shown that her influence would have limits, and those limits were being established by Charles. That is exactly why the decision could hurt so deeply. Charles could argue that he was protecting the monarchy. Camilla could still feel that she was being pushed away. Both perceptions could exist at the same time, and that tension gives the story its real weight. The king was making a calculation about the institution. Camilla was experiencing the calculation as a change in her relationship with him. Those are not the same thing. The most difficult part may have been that Charles did not appear prepared to negotiate the core decision. He could discuss details, he could explain the reasoning, he could adjust practical arrangements, but the central direction had already been chosen. That left Camilla with a difficult reality. She could oppose the change, but opposing it would not necessarily stop it. She could question the reasoning, but questioning it would not restore the old structure. She could remain publicly loyal, but loyalty would not automatically return the influence that had been reduced. This is where the story moves beyond hurt feelings. It becomes a question of power. Who controls access to sensitive royal decisions? Who determines which responsibilities belong with which members of the family? Who decides when the present generation should make room for the next? Charles had answered those questions through action, and the answer did not favor Camilla in the way she had expected. If this decision feels like the kind of royal power shift that deserves to be examined rather than ignored, then do not scroll away and pretend it means nothing. A like, a share, and a subscription are simple ways to say that quiet decisions affecting the balance of the monarchy should not disappear without scrutiny. The irony is that Charles may have believed the restructuring would protect the institution from future conflict. Instead, it risked creating a new source of tension inside his own family. Because every transfer of responsibility changes relationships. William gains greater relevance. Catherine becomes more closely connected to the future structure. Camilla loses part of the influence she believed she held, and Charles becomes the person responsible for managing the consequences. That leaves him with another difficult task. He has to maintain unity while acknowledging that the balance has changed. Public appearances become more important because any visible sign of division can create fresh speculation. At the same time, the private relationships behind those appearances become more complicated. Camilla may continue supporting Charles publicly, William may continue carrying out his duties, Catherine may continue preparing for the role that lies ahead. But underneath those familiar images, the distribution of responsibility has changed. That is the kind of shift that can take months or even years to fully understand. It also explains why the story cannot end with Camilla's initial reaction. Her devastation is only the emotional beginning. The real consequence is what happens after everyone leaves the room. What happens when William realizes that his concerns have influenced the king's decision? What happens when Camilla understands that the old arrangement is not coming back? And what happens when Charles has to prove that this was about institutional planning rather than personal rejection? Those questions now sit at the center of the family's future. The most revealing detail is that Charles's decision reportedly did not depend on one conversation alone. The correspondence, the competing expectations, and the concerns about future responsibilities had already created enough pressure for the king to act. That means the confrontation was the visible moment. The restructuring was the deeper story, and Camilla's reaction becomes easier to understand once that distinction is clear. She was not simply losing an argument, she was losing certainty about where she stood. For someone who had built a life around duty, that uncertainty could be more painful than any public criticism. The monarchy had always been bigger than one person. Charles knew that, William knew that, Camilla knew it too. But knowing it intellectually is very different from experiencing what it means when the institution you serve begins changing around you. And there was still one final question Charles had not answered publicly. How far would this restructuring actually go? If William and Catherine were being moved closer to sensitive responsibilities now, what would that mean for Camilla's influence later? The answer would determine whether this was merely a difficult adjustment or the beginning of a completely different royal balance. And that answer is where the story becomes even more uncomfortable. Because the next stage is not about what Charles took away, it is about what William and Catherine were about to receive. Stay for that part, because if this decision already changed Camilla's position, what came next could change the family's balance even more, and anyone who cares enough to question what happened should not leave the story before that final consequence is revealed. The most important question is no longer what Charles decided. It is what his decision means for the monarchy from this point forward. Camilla's position may still look secure from the outside. She remains beside the king. She remains visible at major royal occasions. Her title has not suddenly disappeared, yet the story surrounding this decision points to something more subtle and potentially more consequential, a reduction in influence that could change how she operates inside the institution. That is why the word devastated carries weight. It is not simply about an argument that ended badly. It is about the possibility that Camilla entered the dispute believing her position beside Charles gave her a certain level of influence, only to discover that the king was prepared to establish boundaries she could not change. The reported restructuring also puts William and Catherine in a different position. They do not need to publicly celebrate Camilla's reduced influence for the balance to change. If responsibilities are redirected toward them, their connection to the future of the monarchy becomes stronger. Their roles begin to carry greater practical importance, not because someone announces that they have taken control, but because the institution gradually prepares for what comes next. That is how succession works at its most revealing level. It is not always one dramatic handover. Sometimes it is a series of smaller decisions that quietly prepare the next generation before the public ever sees the full transition. For Charles, that may be the logic behind the decision described in this story. The king has to manage the monarchy he inherited while preparing the institution that William will eventually inherit. Those responsibilities can pull in different directions. Camilla represents the present structure that Charles has built during his reign. William and Catherine represent the future structure that will eventually follow it. That does not automatically make one side right and the other wrong. It does, however, create an unavoidable tension. If Charles believes the monarchy needs clearer lines of responsibility, then reducing overlapping influence could make sense from an institutional perspective. But if Camilla believes her experience and loyalty justify a stronger role, the same change could feel like a personal rejection. That is the conflict beneath the headlines. And it explains why the story has continued to attract attention. Royal power is not always measured by titles. Influence can exist in meetings, conversations, access, responsibility, and trust. When those things change, a person's practical position can change even when their public status remains the same. That is potentially what happened to Camilla. She was not publicly removed, but the boundaries around her influence were reportedly tightened. For someone who had spent years standing beside Charles, that could be deeply difficult to accept. The king, meanwhile, faces his own consequence. By choosing institutional restructuring over preserving the previous balance, Charles has created an obligation to prove that the decision was about the monarchy, rather than a personal dispute. If that distinction becomes blurred, the disagreement could produce more questions instead of fewer. William also inherits responsibility from the change. Greater influence means greater scrutiny. If he and Catherine become more involved in sensitive royal matters, every decision they make can be examined through the same question that began this dispute. Are they helping prepare the monarchy for its future, or are internal family tensions simply being rearranged? That question cannot be answered by one private meeting. It will be answered by what happens afterward. Will the new responsibilities remain clearly defined? Will Camilla accept the reduced influence? Will Charles be able to maintain a stable relationship with both sides? And will William's growing role make the transition to the next generation smoother or more complicated? Those are the questions that now matter. The emotional damage may also be harder to measure than the administrative changes. Camilla can continue performing her duties while privately knowing that the balance has shifted. Charles can continue standing beside her while knowing that he made a decision she opposed. William and Catherine can continue preparing for the future while becoming more aware that their increasing responsibilities may affect other members of the family. This is where the original title finally makes sense. Camilla was left devastated because the decision was not merely about losing a particular area of influence. It represented the loss of an assumption she may have held about her place beside Charles. She could no longer assume that loyalty, experience, and proximity to the king would guarantee the same level of influence in every sensitive matter. Charles had drawn a boundary. William's concerns had helped bring the issue into focus. Catherine's future position formed part of the larger calculation, and the monarchy's long-term direction became more important than maintaining the old arrangement unchanged. The private confrontation, therefore, becomes a symbol of a much larger transition. One generation is still carrying the institution. Another is preparing to inherit it, and Charles is caught between them. That may be the most difficult position of all. He cannot govern entirely for the future because he is responsible for the present. But he cannot govern entirely for the present because the crown itself depends on continuity. Every major decision, therefore, carries consequences beyond the people sitting in the room. That is why this story should not be reduced to whether Camilla won or lost. The deeper issue is whether Charles has found a way to protect the monarchy's future without damaging the relationships inside it. If he has, the restructuring could eventually be remembered as careful preparation. If he has not, this private dispute could become the beginning of a much wider family tension. And that possibility leaves the story open. Because the real test of Charles's decision will not happen in the meeting where it was announced. It will happen afterward. It will appear in the responsibilities William and Catherine receive, in the boundaries Camilla accepts, and in the way Charles manages the relationships that remain. For now, one thing stands at the center of the story. The king made a choice. Camilla opposed it. William's concerns helped force the issue into the open, and the reported restructuring points toward a monarchy increasingly preparing for its next chapter. But the question remains impossible to ignore. That uncertainty makes every later development far more important for everyone involved as events unfold. When a king decides that the future requires a different balance of influence, what happens to the people who helped him build the present? For Camilla, that may be the hardest question of all. Her role is still visible. Her duties continue. Her place beside Charles remains important. But the influence she once expected may no longer be guaranteed. And if William and Catherine continue moving toward greater responsibility, the change may become even more obvious with time. That is why this story does not truly end with Charles's decision. It begins there. The next chapter of the monarchy will reveal whether this was a careful correction, a permanent transfer of influence, or the first sign of a much deeper shift inside the royal family. So if you believe important royal decisions should be questioned rather than quietly accepted, do not just watch this story and move on. Like it, share it, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Let your support show that silence should not be the price of keeping uncomfortable royal questions out of sight. And stay close, because the next video coming to this channel goes even deeper, and what happens next could make this decision look like only the beginning.